budget is to look into the growth recovery process, because these are extraordinary times. Growth recovery is given utmost importance in the budget. But at the same time, you can understand that there are global uncertainties. And yesterday, some of the students must have taken a look into this MPC meetings minutes, that is Monetary Policy Committee meetings minutes. Why I'm saying this? Budget is not a one-point program, or it is not set in isolation from the global uncertainties or the domestic macroeconomic uncertainties. So before getting into the fiscal arithmetic, let me tell you the macroeconomic uncertainty is in which the budget is presented. Of course, from the position of strength, our finance minister Nirmala Sitharaman has, given her budget with growth recovery as the prime importance. But when you look into the macroeconomic uncertainties, you will be able to understand that, there's a kind of fiscal monetary policy coordination that is very important for this budget to be really functional, to impact on the growth recovery process. In the sense, our interest rate since May 2020, we kept that repo rate constant at 4%. And now we thought that given the global uncertainties, RBI might be taking a decision to go ahead with slightly increasing the interest rates. But it hasn't happened yesterday. Why it hasn't happened yesterday? Because if you increase the interest rate, then you can understand that interest rate and investment, they are inversely related. We need to keep the interest rates lower for investment to be triggered, investment to be sustainable for the growth recovery process. So in this tug of war between RBI and Government of India, or RBI and North Block, the Ministry of Finance, of course, would love to argue to RBI to keep the rates lit lower. Why? Because, RBI is also a kind of, dealing with the public debt management. It has to be it has not taken entirely out of the RBI. So from the perspective of public debt management, we need to keep the interest rate lower. From the perspective of growth recovery process, we have to keep the interest rate lower. And, public debt management in the sense, if the interest rates are higher, then, the cost of borrowing for the government may go higher. You can understand. And the past debt, that is interest payments, if they go higher, if it is in the floating rates of interest, then, that interest payments will also be increasing. So there are many concerns the moment we think about increasing the interest rate. But I will tell you why it's a mounting pressure. Inflation is mounting. If you look at the WPI index, if you look at the November figures, it's more than 14%. Now in December, it's around 13 to 14. And if you look at the CPI, the consumer price index based inflation, that's hovering around 6%. And you know that RBI decides the inflation targeting based on CPI inflation as the nominal anchor at 4%. And of course, we have a band. That band is plus or minus 2. So up to 6%, that inflation, it's okay officially. It's acceptable in the sense. But beyond 6%, we are getting into, it's a bit of uncomfortable zone. The comfort zone stops the moment inflation crosses 6%. And what can RBI and central government or the budget can do about inflation? Because if you ask me, uneven recovery is a matter of concern. Inflation is a matter of concern, and also unemployment. So these three issues, we need to focus how to tackle these issues. Why, the Government of India, when they announced the budget 2022, there was not even a single announcement related to containing inflation, because by mandate, through an agreement between the Government of India and RBI, the Ministry of Finance and RBI, there is a new monetary policy framework. And as per that, inflation containment is the prime objective of RBI through that inflationary expectations channel. And we do believe that inflation containment will happen through the interest rate policy adjustments. But at the same time, now RBI is in a dilemma, because if you increase the interest rate, will that be a kind of aggressive normalization procedure from the economic stimulus packages and the announcements related to interest rate? Can we go ahead with an aggressive normalization procedure when the economy is just recovering? But of course, it is an uneven recovery. We will get into a story a little later. But these are the concerns. On the top of that, you have pressures from US Fed Reserve. We have seen in the Jackson Hole meetings, that's the meetings in which you get the narrative of what central bank in US is going to do, because their policy announcements are very important, from the perspective of emerging economies' macroeconomic policies. Why I'm saying so? Because if they increase the interest rate, then the foreign capital of our country, especially the component relate to foreign investors' investment and the portfolio investment, which is hot money in nature, that can respond to high interest rate changes. And they, of course, respond to the countries where interest rate is high. So that interest rate differentials and the capital flight, that's a matter of concern. And earlier, we tackled the issue in 2013, not through the interest rate defense in the beginning. We tried to, float many capital control measures, but it ultimately didn't work effectively. And the efficacy of RBI intervening in the foreign exchange market to stabilize rupee, that was also, having partial impacts that time. So when all these things are not working very well, then macroeconomists, the business investors, and academia, everybody will look ahead to the macroeconomic fundamentals of our country. And macroeconomic fundamentals means your inflation needs to be within the comfort zone. Your term structure of interest rates should work properly. Your current account deficit should be under control, because we have gone up to even 4%, the current account deficit. That's a gap between X and M, exports and imports. But if you look at that financing pattern in the current account deficit, that gap, X minus M, we were conveniently financing through the capital flows. And that in the balance of payment, we have a current account, the capital account, and the capital flows was very crucial to finance that current account deficit. But now if the capital go flighty, go unstable because of this interest rate differentials, if the US Fed Reserve will increase the rate, and if the taper tantrum happens, taper tantrum means after the global financial crisis, there was a lot of liquidity infusion was into the economy. And now, they have started aggressively reducing the balance sheet of the central bank in US, the Fed Reserve, by absorbing that excess liquidity and also thinking about a plausible increase in the interest rate. So such an uncertainty is there. That was the backdrop of this union budget. Now, that policy dilemma, you can appreciate growth first, or you have to get into containment of inflation, and you have to think about how to prevent the capital flight. So this is the dilemma. And yesterday they kept the interest rate lower, or they kept the interest rate status quo, because the growth recovery process otherwise will get affected. But we have to closely watch what US Fed Reserve is going to do. So far they have not increased. So we need to see their next FOMC meetings, at Federal Monetary Committee meeting, Open Market Committee meeting. So we need to look into the FOMC meetings and all, and we have to keep a close eye on the happenings with regard to global financial instability and the Central Bank of the US. That's the macroeconomic uncertainty. And this macroeconomic uncertainty is, hard to measure, and this gets into the decision-making process when we think about the budget-making process. So within these constraints, the narrative put forward by the budget is growth first, and what is the engine of the growth process or the prime driver of the growth process? Government has given emphasis to capital infrastructure or capital investment, public investment in infrastructure. That was given importance, and there was a huge announcement in the last budget also regarding the capital investment. And if you're interested in numbers, I can give you the estimates. Like we announced around 7.5 trillion rupees. That's the centers on capex, which is in the coming fiscal, and this is 2 lakh crore or 2 trillion rupees higher than in 2021-22 revised estimates. And of course, it's more than double when you compare it with 2019-20 figures at 3.36 trillion. Lakh crore is trillion. Okay. And our assumption is this decision is a very bold decision based on the assumption that public investment crowds in private investment. That's a kind of narrative. But here we need to analytically look into the size of government and the other major component of the expenditure, that is a capital and the revenue spending. Okay, we need to look into the revenue spending in addition to this bold narrative of increasing the capex. There, the picture is a little unsatisfactory in the sense revenue spending, that got curtailed a bit, especially the spending related to the employment related policies, little bit on the food security and national health missions allocations. So these are matters of concern in the sense if we decrease the investment in the growth infrastructure, the social infrastructure. What exactly is social infrastructure? That's the investment in health, education, nutrition, such kind of social sector related spending. So when you talk about infrastructure, it is not only capital infrastructure, it has to be social infrastructure. And if we reduce, especially in the context of COVID pandemic, if you reduce that can mount humanitarian crisis. So that's the matter of concern. Now, the overall size of government and its linkages to economic growth. Researchers look into this question of link between size of government that is captured through the total expenditure to GDP. That is what you call as a size of government. And this, over the years, people research into the size of government and globalization, size of government and its impact on growth recovery process there. If you look into the kind of ratio of expenditure to GDP, when you compare with 2019, there's a decline in the size of government in terms of that expenditure to GDP ratio. But if you look at the absolute amount, then of course there is an incremental increase in the expenditure, the total expenditure. But that expenditure has happened through the capex, but little bit at the cost of revenue spending. And how you do the fiscal consolidation, you have on one side tax or the revenue, on the other side expenditure. And fiscal consolidation, how you define that by fiscal rules or through the fiscal responsibility and management. There is a norm or a rule here in India that we need to maintain fiscal deficit to GDP ratio at 3%. Now we have deviated from that 3% norm. It's not only India. There is a fundamental rethinking in the fiscal rules, process and procedures all over the world in the time of pandemic, that if you strictly follow a threshold level of fiscal rules, like you need to keep 3% of GDP your fiscal deficit, that of course will affect the growth recovery process in the time of crisis and pandemic. So accommodative fiscal policy, by having a flexibility regarding your fiscal rule, that's the norm of the day. So there is an accommodative fiscal stance right now because economy is in the growth recovery process. And what exactly is accommodative fiscal policy stance in India? We decided that we will keep the fiscal deficit to GDP ratio this year at 6.4% of GDP. Last year, what was the aim? It was 6.8. a slight fiscal slippage is there if you look at the budget estimates and the revised estimates. And this secret, no? In India, the budget process that happened in 3 stages. First, when a finance minister announces the budget, the numbers you're getting, that is the budget estimates. And 1 year after, you get revised estimates. Then if you see some deviation between the budget estimates and the revised estimates, then that's a matter of concern. Why it is unspent, or why the things are deviated, why the tax projections are not realized, why the expenditure is fluctuating. So we need to look into the kind of models we run, the assumptions we run, why there is a deviation. So this exercise is called fiscal marksmanship exercise. And usually in a country, some institutions like fiscal councils, they look into this fiscal marksmanship analysis. But in India, we don't have fiscal council, but institutes like NIPFP closely watching into the budget credibility of the numbers at the national and the subnational government levels. We have a study, and I can share with you that study regarding the fiscal marksmanship. You can take a look into it, and you can also estimate the fiscal marksmanship of the current budget of all the macro fiscal parameters on the expenditure side and the tax side. And I know that you are preparing before your exams on 21st. Uma ma'am has asked me that you are preparing a paper, a small short content regarding the union budget. So analytically, when you look into these aspects, you can look into the size of government and its linkages with the growth recovery. You can take a look into, fiscal marksmanship of the budget numbers that you call as budget credibility. So all these things you can analytically look into when you write your paper. Now, fiscal marksmanship suffered the most in the non-tax revenue front. On the tax revenue, of course, this was a matter of concern. Revenues were uncertain, but if you look into the numbers, taxes are little buoyant, GST and the direct taxes. But in the non-tax, there was huge deviation between budget estimates and the revised estimates relate to disinvestment target. Because India had gone ahead with huge, program about disinvestment, right? If you look into the last year's target and the real, reality, the target was 1.75 trillion or 1.75 lakh crore rupees. And the collections from the disinvestment proceeds touched only 9,330 crore. So you can understand that shortfall is huge. And it is not a one-time shortfall. And 2 years back, if you look into the numbers, our target was very ambitious at 2.1 trillion, 2.1 lakh crore rupees. And the reality of what the proceeds we realized was only 32,000 crores then. That's why in this year's budget, if you look at the estimates are very conservative. What we can reach or what we can attain given the uncertainty. So Finance Ministry has projected tax projections. That's a very conservative estimate. And disinvestment also, they downward revised that. And it's a very conservative or realistic estimate this year, so that this budget credibility question they tackle. Because if there is a huge deviation between budget estimates and revised estimates, and if the multilateral agencies like IMF and all, if they start looking into the budget credibility, the quantification of numbers, this deviation may be so huge in the context of India, and that credibility question can put us into severe problems. So this year's estimates are very realistic estimates, so that we will not get that deviation so huge. But my hunch is RE should be greater than BE for the tax projections, because otherwise if we have conservative BE estimates and next year our tax projections is even below RE, then of course that's a matter of concern, that why we are not able to collect taxes, why our tax GDP is very low. So that will be a matter of concern. So the way I was speaking to you is, first we started talking about deficit, then we opened the budget and got into the revenue side. We understood that the taxes are buoyant, but there are concerns regarding disinvestment proceeds targets. Then we got into the expenditure side of the budget. And we are so happy and celebrating that the government is putting focus on capex. But at the same time, there are matters of concern regarding revenue expenditure. So you can understand that the budget is divided into two parts, revenue and capital. Then revenue receipts, capital receipts on one side. On the other side, revenue expenditure and capital expenditure. And these are the four components you need to look into meticulously when you are reading the budget. Now the question is, union budget, it has its own impact on the state governments as well. So you may be asking a question in your term paper after looking into the fiscal arithmetic of the budget. What is its impact on the subnational governments, especially when some of the state governments are getting into elections? So Finance Minister has used this budget as a tool of political economy narratives, in the sense, has she announced anything related to the states which are going ahead with elections like Uttar Pradesh, Punjab, Uttarakhand, Manipur and Goa? Anything to woo the voters of these states? Nothing has happened in that regard. Only from the political economy perspective, if I look into, one announcement may appeal to the rural voters. That is a targeted cash transfer announcement. That is the PM Kisan benefit amounting to, like 9,000 per farmer. That announcement was, little apposite in the context of upcoming elections, in the sense to appeal the rural voters. Other than that, I could not see any particular political economy announcement. And it is very good that Finance Minister has not done that, and she kept her focus on the overall economic recovery of our country, of our economy. Now, economic recovery will happen only if you tackle the cyclical and structural impediments in the economy. And the announcements are just related to, using the fiscal policy as a counter-cyclical policy tool to correct the cyclicality. Then we may not get the growth story correct. And I think I flagged this point when I got an opportunity to speak to you 6 months back. That was like icebreaker. You remember that day we had a lovely conversation about the the public choice, the voting models, the political economy. So I do remember your active participation then. And you can understand that a finance minister is not just a technocrat, she is a politician as well. So when you look into the budget, you need to put a lens to the political economy of the budget. It's not a technical annual financial statement. There is a political economy narrative for every budget, and that can also be highlighted when you put forward your paper. And the political economy, you can understand that nothing has happened to incentivize the calculus of voting behavior or the consent of the voters in terms of announcing something which we call as clientele based announcements, like a populist announcement. Such things has not happened, but the focus was on growth recovery. That's welcome. But our concern is why it has happened at the cost of revenue expenditure, why there was like a drastic reduction in some of the components related to revenue expenditure. Will there be announcements outside the purview of budget to tackle this human development financing aspects? And I do believe that some announcements may happen regarding this. And I have attended the press conference after the budget announcement, and in that budget announcement, expenditure secretary, finance secretary, the narrative was that they are aware of this, especially when they talk about the NREGA, the employer of last resort, the job guarantee schemes, why it is cut. The concern was that they are willing to increase the spending. It is based on demand driven programs, so they will do the needful, but the counter question to that is we should not have reduced that, because the allocation, that allocation, certainty in the allocation is very important for planning the programs and to give the wages when the people come and demand labor and when they are getting into the cycle, but then the delay in wages, if you don't put the allocations appropriate in the cycle, in the budget cycle, then that delay in wages, especially when there is a demand sluggishness in the economy, that delay can cause many things. And people are fighting for survival, and this employment guarantee is the method through which we are accessing the demand side. So the allocation had to be intact. So that's a concern, and I do share that concern. And it got drastically reduced. Of course, they are telling they have policy space to increase it, but that concern remains that they should not have decreased the allocation. They should have kept the allocation, because if you look into the numbers, NREGA has been slashed to 73,000 crores from 1,11,000 crores in 2021. And of course to 98,000 crores in the revised estimates for 21-22. And this drastic revision in the estimates, that's a matter of concern, and I do urge that they will protect the allocations rather than they have substantiate their willingness to put the money based on the demand cycle, but no, to plan it itself, to give the wages at the proper time itself. You need to protect the allocation, and we have to wait and see their response regarding that. And of course, many things happened outside the purview of budget since 2020 March. There was a series of announcements regarding fiscal policy for economic stimulus packages. Okay, so we will wait and see if there will be any outside the purview of budget announcements related to tackling humanitarian concern, because uneven recovery is a matter of concern, and our policies need to focus more on small business firms and poor income households. And I do believe that there will be some announcements, because it has not happened through tax cut for the small income firms and tax cut for the small income households. So taxation part, they have not touched other than taxing crypto. Taxation, of course, it is good that they have not touched into taxation reforms or revisions in the tax by raising the tax in raising the tax in the time of pandemic, because that can adversely affect the growth recovery process. So people are also arguing that they could have done some wealth tax. They could have increased the corporate income tax, because we have reduced it, just prior to the pandemic. So these are the ways. Of course, ultimately we need to mobilize the revenue, but aggressive taxation path this moment can lead to problems related to the demand, because that's why they have not taken any path for increasing the taxes. Of course, that's a relief. But when you look into the fiscal consolidation path, that is medium term right now. That is, you must be remembering last year, Finance Minister announced that we need to reduce the fiscal deficit to GDP ratio by 25-26 to 4.5%. So right now it is 6.4, what is pegged this year. Last year was 6.8, but slight slippage to 6.9 happened. And of course, you remember last year's revised estimates, our fiscal deficit was as high as 9.2%. Okay, but that was a part of budget transparency exercise also. It's a matter of big concern, the budget transparency, in the sense, certain kind of borrowings happen through public sector entities and corporate bodies. By definition, that's not the part of fiscal deficit. That's why the estimate doesn't show certain component of deficit that happens through the public sector entities. But that is kept as an annexure in the union budget documents. And there's a huge, shrillness or cry or clamor regarding this budget transparency exercise, that we need to put it into the fiscal deficit. So that cleansing process has happened a bit. That's why, that 9.5 or 9.2% happened last time. So given this cleansing process of keeping the budget transparency and all, we thought that medium-term fiscal consolidation path can be of 4.5 instead of 3% of GDP. The moment we get into that budget transparency exercise by putting forward some of the on board, some of the off-budget borrowing. So that's why they may be thinking about fiscal consolidation of 4.5 instead of that strict 3%. No, that's my hunch. Now, as I mentioned earlier, macroeconomic uncertainties. States are also facing the macroeconomic uncertainties like center government. So what's that link between state and center in this budget? You need to take a look into that. Then two announcements are important. One is the state governments, instead of having 3% of GDP, their fiscal deficit, given the crisis, given the pandemic, they can increase the fiscal deficit, or they can keep a fiscal deficit to 4% of GDP now. But the question is, this 4% of GDP is not just given. A 0.5% of GDP fiscal deficit within that entire 4% is performance linked. And you have to do power sector reforms in order to get that increase in the borrowing space, that extra borrowing space relate to state governments. And power sector reforms is an important area of concern. And in India, that we have sufficient electricity generation in our country to provide electrification, 100% electrification. But why things are not working? Distribution of the power, that companies are in doldrums, they are in loss. We need to support them. What could be the reforms that has to happen to support the DISCOM? And earlier we floated some kind of non-SLR, non-statutory liquidity ratio, that bond we put forward to support the DISCOM companies. State governments gave the guarantee, but that led to deterioration of state finances. But now what's happening is, through the extra borrowing space, if the states are willing to do power sector reforms, then they will get that extra borrowing space to plan their expenditure priorities. And the students who are interested in the power sector, they can use the data, that's a dashboard data in the Ministry of Power. You get state-wise data on the financial efficiency parameters of the power sector distribution companies. And you also get efficiency parameter, operational efficiency parameters of the power sector distribution companies across Indian states. And you have to protect the data, because the dashboard, they don't keep the time series data. So the day you access, put the date that this is the date in which I access this detailed data or cross-section data. Then after a few months or after 1 year, when you access the data, then that's replaced with the new data, right? That real time. Then you can compare with the data you accessed at this point of time and that point of time. That's a way researchers have to build that comparison intertemporally. Otherwise, dashboard data only gives you that real time, right? So that's a huge issue, that we don't have any time series data, but you have to access and protect the data. And look into the financial parameters of power sector. Financial parameters in the sense, tariff revisions are important in the sense to reduce the gap between the aggregate cost and aggregate revenue. Otherwise you will be in perpetual loss. You need to go ahead with the tariff reforms, but that is quite political. Tariff reforms, people will not like the tariff reforms, right? So many states have not gone into the tariff reforms. Next indicator is aggregate technical and commercial loss. Of course, in the distribution, technical loss can happen, commercial loss can happen, but even theft is happening in certain states of India. Even electricity theft is happening, and you need to monotonically reduce that aggregate technical and commercial loss over the years. But if you look at the data across Indian states, things are not good. That AT&C loss is still huge. And the official, the operational parameters, it's like smart metering. Then you segregate your grid for the commercial and distribution. So all these things, commercial and the domestic purposes, all these things, that 6 operational parameter and the 3 financial efficiency parameters, if we look into, power sector is in doldrums and state governments have to be very proactive in cleaning that sector. And why I'm emphasizing this, why union government has emphasized the power sector? Because, as I mentioned earlier, it's a kind of simultaneous policy correction we need to do to get the growth recovery. On one side, instantaneous firefighting to correct the cyclicality measures or the cyclicality issues. On the other side, we use the opportunity, this crisis is an opportunity, as I mentioned in my last lecture also, to get into the structural reforms. That's very crucial. And structural reforms, power sector is one thing, and labor market reforms is another. Agriculture sector reforms, there are a lot of structural impediments in the economy and we need to correct that. Otherwise, the entire analytical framework, that also you can get into, as a backdrop of when you analyze the budget. What is the analytical framework? You look into the budget, into the growth numbers. That is also very conservative now. Like they are not telling that Indian economy will grow above 10% or anything. Estimates are very conservative. Then after mentioning about that estimates, you can take a look into the analytical framework of this growth projections. They give you fan chart, right? Fan chart in the sense they have a range of projections. You can take a look into the Monetary Policy Committee minutes or the report to see the fan charts, like the growth projections they give it in, various, it's a range of estimates. And that's very conservative this time. The Ministry of Finance, Economic Survey, the numbers from the RBI, they are close but not exactly the same number. Even IMF is going ahead with revision, such a crucial revision in short period of time. So things are dynamic here. To me, estimates, if you ask me, ma'am, at what rate the Indian economy will grow, I think instead of giving that estimates, I would love to provide you the framework that it's not based on business cycles, because that dating the business cycles of the ups and downs, that's very tough in the moment of crisis or pandemic. And you need to look into the hysteresis, that is a dependence of our economy on the history, the short term and the long term dynamics, and all these things are very important. And that's why this downturn in the economic growth process, that is permanent scar. Unless you work with the structural bottlenecks of the economy, we will not get an automatic upturn. That's why both RBI and the Ministry of Finance and the subnational governments, Department of Finance need to look into, policies which are beyond correcting the cyclicality and get into structural reforms. And from that perspective, this announcement of 0.5% of the extra borrowing power given to the states based on the power sector reforms, that's welcome. And also regarding the capex announcement, that center state, that linkages of this union budget need to be looked into. That is, capex, heavy lifting of the capex, the capital spending is happening at the subnational government level. It's not the center government. So you need to support the states. So there is an interest-free transfer. There's a loan to the state governments to go ahead with that process of 1 lakh crore or something. And they ask the governments to do it. It's a friend loading. It means don't wait till the end. You have to do it right now. Announce it right now. So those announcements of friend loading the expenditure will also help in growth recovery process. And the structural reforms and capex have multiplier effects. That is for sure. But here time is an important issue. In your model, you may get that 1% increase in the capital spending lead to maybe 1.5 or 1.7% increase in the GDP growth. But that you need to see the models are at the t point of time or t plus 1 or t plus 2 with a lag. That's very crucial the moment you interpret multipliers. You understand, no, multiplier? And, that's very, with utmost caution, you need to read the numbers. Multiplier means in that model, control for many things, you are running the relationship between the GDP and the capex, or the capital spending and the revenue spending. And several econometric models come up with the clue that revenue spending, multiplier effects are less than capital spending, but we cannot take it as a blind narrative to go ahead with just the capex announcement, because time is crucial, and also certain revenue spending are equally important, like capital creating in nature, right? So we need not curtail the revenue spending in the time of pandemic, because school buildings may be there, teachers may not be there, hospitals may be there, but the professional hospital health professionals may not be there, salaries and all, it's a part of revenue spending. So that will lead us into another kind of issue. So we need to be mindful about thinking about the assuming that revenue spending is bad. No, that will lead to. So the emphasis is on public investment in health also. It's not like ad hoc investment in the health sector, because union budget, if you look into our public expenditure in health to GDP, is still below 1%. Of course, last year they announced 64,000 crores and all. Over the next years, there was huge announcement in the last budget. But we need to look into the details in which the financing pattern of that happened. At the same time, if the expenditures related to health are just ad hoc, just we are allocating for the vaccination, that one time kind of allocation, then we are losing this opportunity, this crisis, as an opportunity to correct our health sector. So it has to be long term. The health investment in the health sector needs to be long term. And it has to be, if you ask me a number, I can say that it should be around 3 to 4%, because if you look at other countries where the size of government, this is another analytical question. That is it because the size of government of those countries are higher, they could finance the health sector also, a little bit above 1% of GDP, not like our country where, we are still below 1% of GDP at the union government level, the health investment. No, that also another research question. You can look into the size of government, and there are many countries where the size of government maybe ours is around 15 to 17%, it fluctuates to GDP, but there are many countries in which the total expenditure to GDP may be 10% or something, but their health sector expenditure may be more than 1% or more than 5%. It's a priority you give to the sector. It's not always correct to say that the investment in the health sector is closely linked to the size of the government or the total expenditure to GDP, that fiscal space. It also depends on the priority of the government, So these are the things I thought that, I will flag. And as I mentioned earlier, finance minister is no longer a magician who takes out, a lot of tax related announcements and all, because with the GST announcements and all, that specific tax related, commodity related tax announcements and all, that kind of secrecy is not there in the budget anymore. So that kind of, pulling out rabbits from the hat, that surprise elements or unanticipated things, that of course is not there. And one beautiful thing that happened in this budget is its emphasis on climate change commitments. Such a strong announcement related to the climate change commitments. Of course, the green bond we have announced, in the budget at a glance document that's there in the Ministry of Finance website. You can take a look into the levels of deficit, which I mentioned, this 6.8 slippage to 6.9 in RE, and this year's pegging at 6.4, then overall path to 4.5% in by 2024. All this fiscal consolidation path you can get from the levels of fiscal deficit, but equally important to look into the financing pattern of deficit. And now, of course, the predominant source of financing deficit in India is gross market borrowing. There's no doubt about it. But a slight decline in the gross market borrowing, if you look into the budget estimates and the revised estimates, and the the financing of deficit through the National Small Savings Fund is little higher. But of course, in terms of the magnitude, gross market borrowing, that's itself is huge, like around 70% of the entire financing. I'm not telling that the structure or the composition of the financing pattern has changed from gross market borrowing. It's of course that is a predominant source. Within that, a portion is now earmarked as green bonds. And the green bond is a part of that overall market borrowing in our country, but it's earmarked as green bond. We have to wait and see, because further clarity is not there regarding which are the public projects they will be linked to, which are the sectors, all those details, we are working out. We are getting into those documents right now. And quick thing is, it's a good thing that we have emphasized on greening the fiscal policy. Because this is another area of major debate, given the climate change commitments and what we have committed in the Glasgow meetings. We need to look into the fiscal policy and monetary policy tools, how we are reaching there. And Rajan mentioned monetary policy is not a great tool for climate change commitments, in the sense he mentioned our toolkits are not that ready to tackle with the climate change commitments. And he also mentioned that price stability and financial stability, these are the important areas or the mandate of RBI or central bank. And if you get into climate change commitments, then you are getting into little political economy side, and fiscal policy is able to tackle those political economic questions related to the climate change commitments. Monetary policy, if they get into, then reputation risk can happen given the limited set of toolkits. But at the same time, globally, Bank of England has gone ahead with greening of monetary policy. If you look at Christine Lagarde, she's the chair of European Central Bank, and she has announced that she has commitments towards. She's a central banker. She has commitment towards climate change, and their policy toolkit is via a green stress test. You're asking your top banks and the top investors to look into the green stress test, because this financial stability is a matter of concern, but financial stability can in turn be affected by climate risk and climate uncertainties. So you need to look into that as well the moment you get into the financial stability. Of course, financial stability is a matter of huge concern, and in this budget also, the narrative is that we will support the small and medium-term enterprises and small business firms. It's through the credit infusion. But as Stiglitz pointed out, as Stiglitz and Rashid in their paper, Which Economic Stimulus Works, in that paper they pointed out that credit-related economic stimulus programs have got its own limitations. Its own limited multiplier effects, because you may be willing to give a credit, that credit deployment is there, liquidity infusion, you're willing to do that, but see the demand side. Why there is an uneven access to credit? Who is accessing this credit in announcements? If you look into the credit deployment data, personal loans is on high. That you may be doing a kind of, not exactly the Ponzi finance, but you are taking another loan to repay your earlier debt by taking at very high rates of interest. Then things are, getting into a bubble, right? In order to repay the old debt, you get into a personal loan or get into a debt with the people around you, that indigenous bad money lenders at a very high interest rate you are taking, because your economic activity is not picking up. There is a demand issue in the economy. So what are the kind of demand side announcements and the policies which we can do because we have not tested it. We fear that if we do that demand huge macro fiscal programs, just like the way Janet Yellen has announced, the Treasury Secretary of US, that is Finance Minister, Treasury Secretary is like our Finance Minister. She announced the huge macro fiscal programs, but of course the overheating and all happened there. I can understand that, but at the same time, what could be that alternative policy to trigger the demand side? Otherwise, if it is just supply side, then I like I mentioned, credit, it's ready, but who is accessing the credit? Why there is an uneven access? Why there is an uneven recovery? Why the small firms, they are, scrambling with their own personal savings to pay the salaries, or otherwise they're cutting down the salaries. All these things are happening. That crisis is there. We need to acknowledge, and I hope that there will be an announcement related to a stimulus package for the small business firms and poor income households, which I do believe that we have not yet completely cleared the issues related to these two sectors. And I do believe that there will be an announcement very soon outside the purview of budget to tackle this uneven recovery, because we cannot close our eyes to uneven recovery, because India is growing for whom? If you look into the GDP numbers, it is profit-led. It's a profit-led recovery. So even if economic recovery is happening, when we talk about the country-specific issues in the recovery path, it's globally acknowledged that uneven recovery is a matter of concern. Inequality is widening. In such cases, we need to use long-term public financial management tools to get the economy back to the equilibrium. And the globally, these public financial management tools are, gender budgeting. That's a promising thing, because women suffer from the pandemic and the crisis most. So we cannot say that we will tackle the macroeconomic crisis first and we will get into your issues. No. When there is a crisis, the intra-household adjusts. And within the intra-household, there is an inequality, and public policy has got a role to play over there. And the initial economic stimulus announcement, we have announced something related to poor, for women, for farmers. But right now, from the budget speech, a quick check is how many times a word is used in the budget. Not economists, but the social scientists, they use it as a powerful tool to understand. Like they just type it and see the word count. So states was, I think the word count, I thought it's around 17. Women, nothing is there. Nari Shakti, one term was there. Poverty, poor, there are many words which we look into from the human development perspective was quite absent in the budget. Maybe outside the purview of budget, announcements will be there. Otherwise, the overall narrative has shifted from, government announcing a lot of last mileage, walking the last mileage, like welfare models announcements like Ujjwala, supporting the low-income households with clean fuel. But that is rollback. There are many schemes that are rolled back right now, and convergence has happened. At the same time, the government is putting a lot of emphasis on capital projects. So that unevenness, with that, acknowledgement of this uneven recovery, I stop my lecture and look forward to your concerns, and we will have a conversation now. Over to you. Floor is open. Thank you. Apurva, your question on crypto and central bank digital currency. I can understand that there is a bit of confusion. It's not only in your mind. We economists are also grappling to understand what exactly is that. As you mentioned, taxing the crypto, does it make it legitimate? That's a question Apurva asked me. Is it because people are engaging in a lot of crypto transactions, and is it a message that you can deal with the crypto transactions? It's not illicit. It's okay. Is it giving a legitimacy to such kind of transactions, the digital transactions, the anonymity? Everything is welcome the moment you announced your taxation policy regarding that. The answer to that, many tax officials also clarified that taxing an asset doesn't make it legitimate. The examples they cited, the tax officials cited, is that, you can tax an asset, legitimate or illegitimate, but taxing doesn't make it legal. That's the only narrative that's coming out. I can understand that there are a lot of confusions that, of course, this is a kind of announcement that it's made, legal in our country. No. What exactly should have happened? The regulatory framework or the regulatory mechanisms for the crypto asset transactions. So another question in the press conference asked to Finance Minister was that whether such kind of regulatory framework is on board, because that bills and all, that kind of legal route, that's evolving. But before that, you tax the crypto assets. But, I am still, trying to understand finance minister's response regarding that, but I am unable to understand that. But all what I can tell you is, finance minister's response was that she cannot wait till the regulatory framework on board to tax when certain assets, huge transactions are happening in the economy. But I am not convinced regarding that. What do you call? It's partial in the sense. Maybe that clarity regarding the framework of the crypto assets and all, we need to wait. I don't have any clarity or any specific knowledge from the Lutein circle here in Delhi regarding that. Only thing is that exposure to the press conference that has happened after the budget. So I am looking into various dailies, newspapers, any announcements regarding the clarity, and also that how far the regulatory framework is going to be put on board. So this is what regulatory framework, that's very crucial. Now coming to the next part of your question on the digital currency. Of course there is an ambiguity over there also, Apurva, you are correct. And philosophically or theoretically, digital currency can ease transactions. One moment. It's a wonderful tool to ease the transactions, and it can help entrepreneurs because, in the time of pandemic or in the time of crisis, and when you have a fiscal policy strategy post-pandemic, I think we have to give emphasis to entrepreneurial skills for the growth recovery process. And for entrepreneurs, this digital currency, that can be very helpful, especially to ease the transactions cross-border. And we cannot say no to any evolution or a financial innovation. That's a financial innovation, that anonymity is kept and you're doing the transactions. But if the regulatory framework is not on board, that can lead to huge cyber crimes. It can lead to a lot of financial integrity questions. These are the negatives. That financial integrity, that needs to be maintained. Otherwise it's based on a trust model. Otherwise this fails. And over the years, I am willing to accept the evolution that's happening in the money and finance field because it has evolved over time. And I do believe that the central bank currency or crypto, that's an addition to it. That evolution, I'm looking at it from an open mind. But what I am worried about is the kind of lack of regulatory framework on board. Let's look into the similar debates that has happened in US economy, and you can read the article by Barry Aiken-Green. He talked about the digital currency or the digital dollar, and he highlighted a perspective of Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary. She mentioned two important things regarding the digital currency or the digital dollar. One is, when a place is highly unbanked, in order to reach to the poor or to all sections of people, the transactions can happen digitally. The way the vendors and all now, if you don't have cash, I can go ahead with the cashless transaction, you Google Pay or some kind of thing. We're getting research questions that how this digital infrastructure is easing the transactions of people to a cashless society. But all these things happen only if the digital divide is tackled. In India, the digital divide is very huge. So that's a birthright now for the Indian citizens, that the access to the digital world, that divergence in the access to the digital world is huge. We need to correct that digital divide. So one moment, let's assume that that's done, that people are having access to the digital world, rich and poor alike. Then it will help in easing the transactions. Transaction costs, like you go to the bank, checks, many things, many process, that waiting time, all these things, this transaction cost, psychic cost, everything can be reduced if it is online and if it is digitally. All these things I accept. It is a real time cost is also not there, and it will help entrepreneurs in doing that ease of business. Everything is accepted. But in US, they have a Fed wire there's a system, an intricate system in which the transactions are monitored. So what is that kind of a mechanism in which our cross-border transactions are monitored, just like the Fed wire? We need to read more into those kind of regulatory and institutional frameworks which are required for doing this smooth. So these are areas of concern. Then small business firms, they do access banks for their business. So taking them away from that banking to the market sector and also to the digital markets, that transition has to be very smooth and they need to be given support. So given all these structural, institutional and the regulatory framework on board, I do believe in the benefits of the digital currency. I'm not saying no to the technology innovation. I'm not saying no to that evolution that's happening in the money and finance. But we have to wait and see. And, yesterday in governor's speech, he has given concerns like tulips. He was talking that there's a huge risk in dealing with the asset currency. So he's giving a bit of, uncertain or the risk kind of a perspective when we talk about the crypto, but RBI is working on it. It's not like a out of blue announcement. You can read an article on the central bank digital currency. RBI has published that. So they are working on it last 5 years. And it's not that out of blue government has announced this. We have to wait and see that how it is rolled out and how it is named and when it is going to be, and it's going to be in this fiscal. That's what yesterday our governor also mentioned. So given this positivity from finance minister and governor, let's see and how to reduce the risk and all. We need to wait and see, and we need to understand the structural transformation that's happening, why people are moving away from banking. Our interest rates are very low, and if the inflation is mounting to 6 and officially the interest rate is hovering around 4%, we are getting into negative real interest rates. So our money in banks, in the term deposits and all, we are not even getting the money what we have deposited. So are we in a situation in which we can defend that this 4% is an equilibrium rate of interest in which financialization of savings happen along with, giving cheap credit or cheap loans to the economy so that the investment will happen? And we don't have an answer for that kind of an interest rate which supports both. So when we talk about increasing interest rate, financialization of savings is also an element of concern, in the sense savings in the financial assets go down if India is getting into negative real rate of interest. Real rate of interest is by definition nominal rate of interest minus inflation. And so containing inflation is very crucial. And all these things are matters of concern, but that's why people are now moving into at least 1% of salary or 2% of their salary. They are taking risks to put in mutual funds, to just try a little bit of stock market. But there also things are fluctuating. That financial exuberance is not that great. And we are facing all these things, but yeah, that's it. Apurva, you have any questions? Okay. Yeah, I got a question in the chat box. It's by whom? It's a question related to multiplier effect. The strong multiplier effect of infrastructure spending can be realized only if it is delivered in timely manner. Correct. And of course, it is effectively targeted. Often we neglect the implementation lags. Besides, the investment cycle is biased towards supply side. We need to have an effective strategy to manage demand factors with an adequate focus on sectoral variations. And as you feared, we do fear these aspects. We go wrong in prioritization when strategies get trapped in the political economy, and quite true at the center, at the national and subnational levels. And thank you so much Is it Deepa? Thank you, Deepa, for your presence. Oh, Deepa joined. Huh? I didn't know that. So this is this is a reflection from Uma ma'am, no? Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. I was thinking that, a student leader has put this. It's from Uma ma'am. She has emphasized, it's beautifully said that, this is exactly what I try to focus in my talk also. She has beautifully captured that, and of course the political economy concerns. And thank you, Chechi, for that. Another question. Abhirami has put a question. According to you, what's the current status on gender-based allocations almost after 16 years of focus on that aspect? Abhirami, there are concerns regarding the gender-based allocations in the sense that our gender budget, it's a very promising framework, but at the same time, there's a kind of static allocations in the sector. If you look at the original documents, that was written, that NIPFP pioneering work and the classification of budgetary transactions document where the gender budgeting was, institutionalized in our country. In the beginning, somebody mentioned about this gender budgeting. I have closely worked with Ministry of Finance regarding this, and I came to know that the sad part of it is now we are focusing only on this budget statement, gender budget statement. But gender budgeting is a broader framework than gender-based budget statement. If you look at gender budgeting, gender budget statement is only one tool of gender budgeting. It is not everything. But now there is a tendency among us to look into just GBS, just gender budget statement, and we are happy with the gender budgeting analysis. No, it has to be broader than just statement. And prior models, if you look into, our emphasis was also on ex-ante processes, like a change in the program design and how you can incorporate the gender-based allocations, increased gender-based allocations, linking to, goals. What are the gender goals in your state? If you identify that over the years, if you have to reduce that to a certain target, what is the roadmap to do that, and what is the allocation support for that? That kind of new programs, that change in the program design, that is very crucial. It has to be done at the ex-ante level, but applying gender lens to the existing allocation is only exposed, and that is confined to this allocation. So now there is a revelation at the state government and central government level that, as you rightly mentioned, Abhirami, that why the allocations are getting stagnated, we need to go ahead with ex-ante processes. And, I am privy to certain discussions at the state level. We have to wait and see which are the states going to be proactive regarding this ex-ante process. That's the only clue I can give, but evolution is happening. That's one thing. Second, we used gender budgeting space to come up with many new programs, like we addressed the sex ratio issue, which is happening even prior to birth. Beti Padhao, Beti Bachao, my Hindi is very poor. But what happened to that scheme right now? Of course, it is good from the public financial management to go for convergence of schemes. But in the process of convergence of the public expenditure across sectors, now we get an umbrella estimate after this convergence. And as Beti Padhao is coming into this umbrella program, unable to track the expenditure that is earmarked for that particular program. And we are grappling with this transparency issue right now. Second, energy infrastructure. That was a kind of an ex-ante. So it's incorrect to say that in India we have done only exposed gender budgeting. Ex-ante has not happened. It is incorrect. Ex-ante happened through this recognizing, gender discrimination even before birth, recognizing the aspects related to Energy infrastructure, what could be the gender budgeting there to protect the women and child from, respiratory illness and increased mortality from that, which is higher than the mortality rates from malaria. That indoor air pollution was a matter of big concern. Then petroleum, prima facie, it's a very gender neutral, department. Like all of you, if Ashtami is in finance, then people can ask what finance department will do for gender. If Farsana is in immigration, external ministry, she has to do gender budgeting. Then, she has to come out with that gender analysis. It's not only that education, health, ministries will talk about gender. No, it's not just social infrastructure sector. It's broad. It's infrastructure. It's immigration. It's petroleum. So petroleum ministry, that's very gender neutral in the sense. But they have identified a program of applying gender lens in the energy infrastructure. Energy infrastructure has got a gender lens. So these are the spaces or the ex-ante processes that happened in which the program design was changed and new programs were announced. But the concern is the new programs were either rolled back after a point of time, or fiscal marksmanship is an issue. Second, third is convergence. So there are many issues regarding these announcements, and we hope that there will be a jump in the allocation. And jump in the allocation is one story, as I mentioned. If that is not properly allocated, fiscal marksmanship, if there is a huge difference between your estimates and BE and actually spent, then there is no point in having high budgetary announcements. So these are the different issues, like that ex-ante analytical framework, fiscal marksmanship, convergence of the public spending issues. These are concerns, and we need to work with the gender neutral ministries to come up with gender lens and what are the kind of gender based analysis they are going to do. So it's a very promising framework, and I do believe that this, I was talking to students in NIT Roorkela, and one of the students asked me, ma'am, will gender budgeting become a radical tool so that every household, every woman talk about it, about their rights and their space and access to the public money? It's our money, and what government is planning for women, for us. So such kind of an empowerment process happen, that radical revolution will happen in India, so that every household people talk about gender budgeting, that policy space in which we can articulate and we can have a stake on the public money. So such kind of revolution will it happen. So that kind of a powerful tool will it become. So I told that I do share your concern, and we have to wait for such kind of a participatory budget process and the voice of the people in the fiscal making process. And in that sense, it's a powerful tool, not only as a public financial management tool, but to mobilize the public action into public policy. That is also very relevant, and gender budgeting can be such a tool in the near future. Yes. Abhirami, you are on mute. You just wrote to me. Now, the question from Rekhu. Okay, Rekhu just told me good evening. Okay, Parvati. Yeah, I cannot see any other questions related to the budget, but thank you so much for the positive responses, and that's it.